Consciousness is one of the aspects of psychology that we experience every day and still don't think about. Uh, so when we look at consciousness, just like any other psychological concept, first we have to define consciousness. What is consciousness? And consciousness is everything you're thinking about, everything you're aware of at any given moment. Your awareness of your entire surroundings, your awareness of yourself. Uh, Keep in mind, though, that consciousness is an aspect of perception, not an aspect of sensation. You are sensing the world around you even when you're not conscious, even when you're in an altered state of conscious. Your senses don't change, it's your perception that does. Your consciousness is constantly flowing, constantly changing. We still use the term stream of consciousness that William James gave us in 1890 because it's still relevant and still useful to us. So when you think about consciousness, be aware that it's this constantly shifting, moving, very fluid concept. The study of consciousness defined psychology's early days. When you look back at Wundt, when you look at structuralism and functionalism, studying consciousness is what psychologists did in the 1800s. However, during the 20th century, during the 1900s, we abandoned this for the most part and went instead into behaviorism, where we could actually study things that you can see, things that you can look at and examine. However, in the late 20th century, we had advances in methodology, we had advances in computers, we had advances in neuroscience and neuroimaging, and we were far more able to actually look at consciousness as something that's actually happening, and something that we can not so much measure, but at least theorize and discuss as a point of scientific curiosity. When we try and define consciousness, and it is very much a verb in psychology, consciousness is something that you do. Consciousness is an action. And it requires attention to your surroundings, that you're actually paying attention, right? To something, not necessarily to everything, but to something. That you're also monitoring. And monitoring doesn't necessarily require attention, but you can be monitoring your surroundings without necessarily paying attention to them. While I'm getting ready for work, for instance, I'm not necessarily paying attention to the train, but I am monitoring for the train because I need to know if I can go straight to work or have to go around the train. So monitoring and being aware, and sort of being aware of it without necessarily paying attention. We also remember. We're constantly remembering things. We're constantly bringing up schema and models for things that we've experienced in the past in order to help us solve problems in the present. And then also planning for the future, your next steps, even planning seconds in advance, even if you're not planning for days or weeks in advance. We do still do a significant amount of planning in our conscious awareness. We can come back to this parallel processing model when we look at consciousness and the brain's ability to process multiple aspects of a task simultaneously. Now remember, a computer can't do this. A computer has to process everything one at a time, and though a computer does this very quickly, it cannot match the amount of processing information, the amount of processing power that your brain has, and the ability to process multiple tasks simultaneously and to process all aspects of those tasks as well. At any given time, you have literally thousands of neural networks active all at the same moment throughout your cerebral cortex and throughout the rest of your brain. And to give you kind of an impression of how powerful these neural networks are, keep in mind that if you were to throw a baseball, in order to get the baseball to go exactly where you want it to go, you have a window for opening your hand of approximately, I think it's a 1/100th of a second, but it takes as much as a 1/4 of a second for the neural impulse to get from your brain to your hand. So you actually have to plan significantly in advance in order to release your hand at exactly the right time. Conscious awareness takes place dramatically in the cerebral cortex. This area of your brain, remember, is the top area of your brain, that wrinkly, very complex portion of your brain that's the most advanced area. And this, it is responsible for your conscious awareness of objects and for your ability to pay attention to things. Blind sight is actually a neurological condition in which there's damage to the brain itself, the occipital cortex in particular, that leaves an individual effectively blind. As far as they are aware, they can't see. They're not processing visual information. But if you, for instance, toss a ball to them, they can still catch it, because they are still processing this visual information. They're just not processing it consciously. So just because you're aware of something doesn't mean that you're consciously aware of something. And that's actually really important, that we're not always aware of all of the stimuli around us, even though we are monitoring that stimulus. Okay. We also have, or we rather had, some experience with split brain patients. Remember that split brain patients occur with people with severe epilepsy when the doctors have gone in and cut the corpus callosum that unites the left and right hemispheres of the brain. With split brain patients, these two halves of the brain have difficulty communicating with one another, and in particular because the right half of the brain has difficulty communicating verbally, you get some very interesting effects with split brain patients, in particular a form of blind sight. What happens is, if you allow someone to see, because the two halves of the brain actually control the opposite side of the body, if you cover up the left eye and allow only the right eye to see, then the left half of the brain is the portion that is able to see at that point. And if you allow the right eye and thus the left half of the brain to see an object, the split brain patients could name the object, as you see here in the image with the baseball. You allow them to see with their right eye, and they can see the baseball and say, "I see a baseball." On the other side, if you cover up the left eye, allow them to see with the left eye, so cover up the right eye, so that the right half of the brain can see, and you show them an image of something, in this case, say a screwdriver, they may report not being able to see, but if asked to use the left hand to pick up the object that they see, they will accurately choose the object that is displayed. It's a form of blind sight that's fairly unique to these split brain patients. And over time, this split brain effect reduces as the brain learns to communicate in other ways, particularly using the brainstem and the suprachiasmatic nucleus, where the visual nerve crosses from one side to the other. The brain can actually communicate across using those nerves. It's just not as efficient. The thalamus is the brain's relay station. This sits very deep in the midbrain and acts as the relay station for most of our sensory information. The vast majority of your sensory information comes in and is routed through the thalamus and then pushed out to the appropriate areas of your brain. So if you receive tactile information, it's routed up to your somatosensory cortex. Auditory information is routed to your temporal lobe, that sort of thing. Damage in these nuclei, the intralaminar nuclei and the midline nuclei, which are part of the thalamus, damage in those can result in a coma because the individual is not capable of being aware of or responding to the sensory information from the outside world. If it occurs only on one side of the brain, then the patient loses conscious awareness on one half of the body. But it's important that they only lose conscious awareness on one half of the body. They still retain this sort of blind sight awareness of the other half of the body, and that half of the body can still respond. It just doesn't respond as efficiently as it used to. When we start looking at consciousness, we can start looking at, we usually start by looking at Freudian theory. Now, Sigmund Freud talked about consciousness in what is really the first way that we could really easily describe consciousness and talk about it, even if his description was a little off. He discussed consciousness as sort of being the very top surface, sort of the tip of the iceberg, as it were. About 10% of what goes on in your mind, he said, is in your consciousness at any given time. And he described your pre-conscious as well. And he said that your pre-conscious is all of the information that you have, everything in your past, all of your awareness, your memories, your skills, your talents, that can be called upon easily if you need it. Everything that you can remember very quickly, should you require that information, is stored in your pre-conscious. Your unconscious is information from your past that it's still stored in your memory. It's still there, but you can't easily access it. We have this technique, he said, called repression that pushes this unconscious down and prevents it from leaking into your consciousness and causing you distress or worry or causing you to act out in a violent or unacceptable fashion. Okay. And he described all kinds of things that are in everyone's unconscious, this creeping, crawling monsters sort of that exist down beneath your awareness. And when you're asleep, when you're dreaming, your unconscious sort of comes up to the surface and exposes itself and becomes all these deep, dark symbols in your dreams. And that's why he wanted to talk about dreams all the time. It's important to note that repression is a Freudian concept, and we don't talk about repression anymore. It's not part of the modern psychological vocabulary. He talked about it and he described it, but it's not useful to think that way. It's not useful for us to have this idea of wishes and fears and all these things that are repressed and inaccessible to the conscious mind. In fact, we found that most of these deep, dark wishes and fears that exist, none of them are as dark as Freud wanted them to be, and they are all accessible to us. We do suppress them, we do prevent them from coming up, but it's more of a conscious activity, and we can reduce the amount of suppression that is occurring so that we can be aware of them and talk about them over time. Modern psychology does not talk about repression. Instead, we talk about the consciousness and the unconsciousness. And we sort of delete this idea of the pre-consciousness because there is no repression. There's no boundary between what we can and can't recall into our memory. Instead, we can talk about explicit versus implicit memory, where explicit memory is everything that you can consciously recall, talk about, think about, your episodic and semantic memories with the facts and information that you've learned and the things that you've experienced in your life. With the implicit memory being things that you're not consciously aware of, such as tying your shoes, being able to drive a car, for instance. These are things that you do sort of automatically and at an unconscious level because you don't have to be consciously aware of doing it anymore. So this implicit memory is part of our unconscious awareness and our unconscious monitoring of the world around you. And we can pull a lot of these unconscious behaviors into the consciousness very quickly. If you're driving down the highway, you're often not thinking about all the little things you have to do to stay on the road and stay going where you need to go. But if you see an 18-wheeler pull ahead of you and start weaving, all of a sudden you are very aware of everything you're doing to drive. And so we have that mechanism that we can pull something from the unconscious into the conscious when we need it. Right? And the Freudian concept doesn't really allow us to do that. We see generally implicit memory and unconscious processing as being about 90% of what goes on in your mind. All this monitoring of the world around us, the unconscious tasks that we do every day, even as small as facial expressions, up to things like monitoring your blood chemistry and pH, dealing with heart rate and digestion speeds. All of that is about 90% of what your brain does at any given moment. And it's an enormous amount of information, far more than even our most sophisticated computers can keep up with. Well, up until now, we've talked mostly about normal consciousness. And normal consciousness is what we experience every day when we're awake and alert and sober. But there are a multitude of altered states of consciousness that can occur for a variety of reasons. Probably the most famous of these is hypnosis. And hypnosis was originally called mesmerism. It was actually named by Dr. Franz Mesmer, who developed this technique he used sort of a rudimentary version of this, using magnets that he would place on the body. And we've since refined it a great deal, and instead of naming it after Franz Mesmer, we instead named it after the Greek god of sleep, Hypnos. And when we talk about hypnosis, we define that as this trance-like state of heightened suggestibility, deep relaxation, and intense focus. That's really all hypnosis is this very relaxed and extremely focused state in which you allow yourself to become more suggestible, so that essentially what the hypnotist says becomes, to a certain extent, true. Now, hypnosis is not quite the way most people think it is, and we'll talk about a couple of the myths about hypnosis in a moment. But first, what is hypnosis? How does it actually work? We have two theories, and we can look at this, for instance, because hypnosis works very well on pain, for instance. We can actually look at the ways that we can use hypnosis to reduce pain. So the first of these theories is a divided consciousness theory, where we look at the idea that we've sort of divided our awareness. We've divided our consciousness into two parts, and one of these parts essentially goes to sleep. This is the part with your executive function, your executive control over your own actions and thoughts. You allow it to relax and sleep and become less aware of the world. So the hypnotist actually becomes your executive function during this time. And this executive function part, this sleeping area of your consciousness, is the part of your consciousness that continues to process pain. I like the divided consciousness theory. I feel like this is more how it works. However, the social and cognitive process theory absolutely has valid evidence for it. Using this theory, we suggest that the participant is motivated to believe in hypnosis. And so they work essentially to ignore the pain on a subconscious level. And you can deliberately shut off pain. With some practice, you can become consciously aware of and consciously in control of your perceptions of things like pain to a certain extent. And hypnosis helps with that. Okay. Hypnosis can also help retrieve suppressed memories that are traumatic or that you're having trouble recalling. Hypnosis can help with that. And hypnosis can help reduce the behavioral component of habits and addictions. For instance, with smoking, hypnosis can help reduce the behavioral functions, for instance, of smoking, where you wake up, you want a cigarette, you have a meal, you want a cigarette, you get in the car, you want a cigarette. Hypnosis can help reduce that. Hypnosis cannot help reduce the dependence on nicotine itself. That chemical addiction is something that your body has to process on its own. There are a variety of myths about hypnosis that have sprung up over the years, in part because of popular media, and in part because of fears of mind control and being taken over and that sort of thing. In reality, hypnosis is not dangerous. Okay? Hypnosis can never ever make you helpless. Hypnosis can never do mind control. You can always wake up from hypnosis if you choose to do so. Just because your executive function is relaxed and not working very hard or almost asleep does not mean that your executive function has stopped functioning at all. Uh, we can use hypnosis to retrieve memories, but it's dangerous. It's risky to attempt to use hypnosis to retrieve memories. Um, there have actually been several cases. One of the most famous cases actually occurred here in Texas, where children were going under hypnosis in order to retrieve memories, and they were retrieving memories of this dark, evil, and it became this a satanic sexual abuse allegations against a pair of daycare owners. They said these children were saying that they were being abused and touched and forced to participate in devil worship rites in the basement of these people's home. Their home didn't have a basement, right? There was no evidence that any of the children had been abused or molested. There was no evidence of satanic worship in the home, nothing whatsoever. And what had happened was that the hypnotists were feeding these children leading questions and essentially implanting memories in these children's mind in order to sort of bring out what they wanted to happen. And children are very suggestible, and children want to please. And so these huge abuse charges, and it ended up being all over the United States, but this first couple was in Texas. They only recently got restitution for the charges against them that were completely false, because hypnosis had been used to implant memories more than retrieve them. And so that's part of why hypnosis is not really reliable in court. They won't use it very much at all. You can also never be hypnotized by ambush. You have to be an active participant in hypnosis. You have to choose to be hypnotized. No one can do it to you. Okay? And you can never be forced to do things under hypnosis. Just like making you helpless, if you choose to wake up at any time, you can. A hypnotist can never keep you under hypnosis. And then we sort of have the myth that everyone can be hypnotized. Most people can. Absolutely, most people can. A few people cannot be hypnotized. And while we don't have sort of a clear definition of who cannot be hypnotized, we know that to a certain extent, in particular, this is an autistic trait, that some people who are autistic have trouble being hypnotized, and it may be extremely difficult for them or even impossible. Another common form of altered state of consciousness is meditation. These are techniques that are designed to refocus attention, block distractions, and produce a relaxed state. Now, while we often see meditation as being sort of the Zen form of meditation, where you're sitting, cross-legged and very calm and sort of half asleep, which actually that form of meditation literally is being half asleep, as the left half, the logical portion of your brain, does fall asleep during that time. There are many different forms of meditation, many of which can actually be done while you are fully awake, functioning, and doing things. Meditation has so many positive effects. Meditation can be used to, for instance, treat pain. It can be used to deal with asthma. It can treat high blood pressure, heart problems, skin disorders, diabetes, viral infections. It can reduce high levels of stress. It can improve pancreas function. And most of these things are a result of stress and distraction that occur throughout our lives. Meditation helps calm all that down and bring it and recenter your awareness of the world around you. In particular, mindfulness meditation, which is simply being absolutely aware and conscious of whatever it is that you're doing at any given time. I practice mindfulness meditation in particular if I'm doing something that's repetitive. If I'm, for instance, eating alone or doing the dishes or folding laundry or something, you can practice this mindfulness meditation to bring your center in. There is actually a Tibetan proverb that if that you should meditate for 20 minutes a day. And if you don't have time to meditate for 20 minutes a day, then you should meditate for an hour each day. Meditation helps save so much time because you're focused, because you're absolutely aware of what's going on at that exact moment, and you're not trying to divide your attention to monitoring a multitude of other things. Um, so mindfulness meditation can absolutely help us save a great deal of time and reduce distraction with practice. Now, when you start meditating, if you can manage to meditate for 2 minutes at a time, you are almost a gifted meditator by yourself. It takes practice, it takes effort, and meditation is not something that you can just pick up and do. Instead, you have to. It's an on-purpose thing, and it requires practice and effort to make it work. So, if you start meditating, don't get frustrated when you can't do it immediately. These are some examples of different kinds of meditation that you can practice. Transcendental meditation is that sort of Zen practice with the crossed legs and bringing your mind up and above your normal state of consciousness. Heart rhythm meditation is actually an excellent way to start meditation, even before you get into mindfulness. And it is simply being aware of your breathing and heart rate while you sit quietly still. And focus on those basic biological functions, because you can't really mess up a heart rhythm meditation. You just have to be aware of it and conscious of the pulse of your heart and the pulse of your body. Focused attention and mindfulness go very much hand in hand, and they're difficult to separate. When we have, we refer to zazen, is that Zen meditation. You can get into that transcendental meditation, the heart rhythm meditation, are both forms of zazen meditation. Qigong meditation is more active when you get into, for instance, mindfulness, when you get into martial arts meditation, when you get into what we refer to as flow, where you're completely focused on a task that you enjoy. It's a form of Qigong meditation. So there are a multitude of kinds of meditation. You find the one that works for you. You find the one that works best, the one that helps you the most. And you can use this form of meditation to help you focus and to help with all of these other health issues that meditation can help with. We've talked about hypnosis and meditation as an altered state of consciousness, but we actually spend about a third of our lives in an altered state of consciousness, simply sleep. We sleep for about a third of our lives, but in all honesty, we don't know why. We actually have two solid theories on why we sleep. The first of these is the adaptive theory of sleep, that we use sleep as a method of energy conservation. There's a period where it's dark and humans are unable to hunt for food because our eyes are so dependent on light to be functional. And so we sleep during the night as a way of avoiding injury and harm to ourselves, and as a way of conserving energy. But there's also the biological theories that suggest that we do a lot of growth, that we do a lot of restoration and healing while we sleep, and we absolutely do. This is why so many organisms sleep, and particularly organisms with strong central nervous systems need more sleep. Because we grow while we sleep, we heal while we sleep. We restore neurotransmitters while we sleep. We conserve energy while we sleep. We remove chemical waste. There's so many things that your body does to restore itself while you're sleeping, that sleep becomes a critical portion of any person's life. And these two theories sort of work together to explain why we sleep and why our sleep patterns are the way they are. Our sleep patterns are determined using circadian rhythms. All right, these rhythms are they're biological rhythms that occur on actually a 25-hour cycle. We determined that our circadian rhythms are on a 25-hour cycle because scientists actually went into a cave where there was no sun, no clocks, no indication of what time it was. And after a couple of weeks of a certain amount of confusion, they settled into this 25-hour cycle where they would sleep and wake at more or less the same times, but on this 25-hour cycle instead of a 24. Our sleep-wake cycle is regulated to 24 hours a day, partially by the suprachiasmatic nucleus. This is a portion of your brain that is right where your optic nerves cross in the center of your brain, and it monitors how much light you're taking in. So when the amount of light you're taking in is reduced, your brain indicates that it is then time to go to sleep and activates the reticular activating system at the base of your skull that causes you to start going to sleep. It activates and causes the release of melatonin, which helps you sleep. It also reduces your body temperature. It reduces heart rate and respiration, prompting you and promoting sleep during that time. Now, there are genetic differences. For instance, morning people versus evening people, there are genetic differences. Some people need more sleep than others. I need, for instance, significantly more sleep in any given night than my wife does. Some people are more prone to insomnia genetically. We also have some people are more sensitive to light levels. Some people produce more melatonin than others. In general, if you're having trouble getting to sleep, do monitor how much light you're taking in. If you're playing on your phone or watching TV late at night, that may interrupt your ability to fall asleep and thus make it more difficult for you to achieve sleep. No matter whether you have trouble staying asleep or not, everyone follows essentially the same 90-minute sleep cycle. There are 4 stages of sleep and sort of a 5th stage, which is actually part of stage 1, called REM, or rapid eye movement sleep. During a normal night of sleep, which is about 8 to 9 hours, we'll generally have about 5 of these sleep cycles. And that's true of anyone. This 90-minute sleep cycle, particularly your first one, is about 90 minutes. Later on, particularly closer to waking up, these sleep cycles may get significantly shorter than that. Now, this is an example. This is actually what the brainwaves would look like on an EEG machine. And you can see we begin with what we refer to as beta waves. When you're awake and alert, your brain exhibits what's referred to as beta waves. As you start getting drowsy, you experience a larger, slower kind of brainwave we refer to as alpha waves. You're awake, but you're drowsy. You're starting to drift off, probably daydreaming a bit. You're having trouble focusing. These alpha waves are starting to take over the way that your brain works. At the moment you fall asleep, and there is a defined moment that you fall asleep, you begin to show theta waves. And these theta waves will last for about 5 to 20 minutes, depending on you, depending on the cycle, depending on how tired you are. The stage 1 sleep, where you get these strong theta waves, is a very light sleep, and it's very easy to wake someone up during this stage. With each subsequent stage, it becomes harder and harder to wake the individual. Stage 2 occurs when we start seeing sleep spindles, which is essentially theta waves with these sudden sharp spikes in them. Stage 2 sleep is more difficult to wake up, and still the individual isn't dreaming at this time. But they are experiencing sleep spindles, which are sort of seed waves to get into delta waves. When you start seeing delta waves more and more, about 25% of the brain waves will become delta waves. We refer to that as stage 3 sleep. Stage 3 sleep is a deeper stage of sleep. It's more difficult to wake the individual up, and these large, very slow delta waves have begun to appear. When you have more than half of the brain waves are delta waves, we're in stage 4 sleep. This is the deepest level of sleep, and it's very difficult to wake someone up out of stage 4 sleep. If you've ever been woken up out of stage 4 sleep, many people actually experience physical pain upon being woken up from this level of sleep, because the effort of pulling your consciousness up all the way to alpha and beta waves from this deep delta wave sleep is very difficult. After spending some time in this stage 4, we rapidly rise through stage 3 and stage 2, and then when we reach stage 1 again, instead of having all theta waves, we enter a stage of REM sleep. And these REM phases can last from seconds to minutes. But it is during this stage when we dream, whether we remember those dreams or not. Here's a little bit more detail. This transition into sleep, where we have this stage 1 sleep, your heart rate slows, your blood pressure decreases, your breathing slows down. All of these alpha waves change into theta waves. Okay. At stage 2, it's about 15 to 20 minutes. Your body becomes more relaxed during this period, and you get these rapid bursts of brainwaves called sleep spindles. Stage 3 and stage 4 show the development of theta waves, okay, and theta waves and delta waves. Okay, these very slow, deep delta waves appearing in the body, or rather appearing in the brain, and these last for about 15 to 45 minutes total for stage 3 to stage 4 sleep. And then you rise very quickly back up through the stages, back up to stage 1 and into REM sleep. Okay. And during REM sleep, while your eyes are moving very rapidly backward and forward, very rarely is REM an up and down motion. It's usually backward and forward. But during this period, your body actually experiences sleep paralysis. That is, your body is not capable of moving. You have shut down your voluntary muscles so they don't function anymore. And this only lasts for the 5 to 15 minutes that you're undergoing REM sleep. And then your body relaxes again, and the sleep paralysis vanishes, and you can start to roll over again as you enter stage 2 sleep. Dreaming is a fairly unique state of consciousness, and we all do enter a dreaming stage, whether we remember those dreams or not. REM sleep is what we generally think of as dreaming, and this is the state in which the dreams that we generally remember occur. Right? We dream almost continuously during REM sleep, but REM sleep only lasts for a few minutes with each cycle. These dreams tend to be very vivid, visual, they tend to be very colorful and have very story-like qualities, even if those stories don't necessarily make sense. Now, not everyone dreams in color. We think about 10 to 15% of the population dreams in black and white. And for a while we thought that might be because people were watching black and white TV. Now we know that that is apparently not the case, because people who don't watch black and white TV still dream in black and white sometimes, or almost always. The REM dreams don't necessarily make sense, except while you're actively in the dream. They usually do make sense during that period. We can also have NREM dreams, that is, no rapid eye movement dreams. These are usually occurred in stage 3 or 4 sleep. They're far less frequent than REM dreams. We can still see them on an EEG, but we don't remember in REM dreams. Even people who do regularly remember their dreams don't remember in REM dreams. They're very less aggressive. They tend to be much slower. We think that they're associated with color or sound or motion, but there's no story-like qualities. They're just a low-grade awareness. And even people who do, very, very rarely, people who were awakened during these NREM dreams can remember them, usually only for a few seconds before it slips away, even if they deliberately try. Lucid dreaming is the practice of becoming aware of the fact that you're dreaming. This almost always occurs during REM sleep. Many people have lucid dreams from time to time simply as part of their dream cycle, and it has nothing to do with any deliberate practice. But you can learn to have lucid dreams. You can learn to essentially wake up during a dream aware that you're dreaming and able to even control the dream to a greater or lesser extent. And that is lucid dreaming, a period of time where you are aware that you are dreaming and even have a certain level of control over those dreams. So why do we dream? The honest answer is we don't know. Dreams don't appear to serve any specific purpose. There's no specific evolutionary advantage that we can pin down to dreaming. And so we've developed a number of theories over the years. The Freudian theory in dream is, of course, wish fulfillment, especially wishes that are dark or dangerous or socially unacceptable, things that we can't do in real life, become expressed in our dreams. And a lot of the Freudian theory, while it's fun to read and fun to think about, it doesn't have any bearing on real life, really. Freudian theory says, for instance, they say, well, if you dream about flying, then you're dreaming about having sex. But if you dream about having sex, that's something entirely different. Like, okay, but what if I like to fly and I'm dreaming about flying because it's a rush to fly? Okay, Freudian theory doesn't take into account individual differences. It doesn't take into account cultural differences. It doesn't take into account the fact that what one symbol might mean to one person, it doesn't necessarily mean that to another person. The information processing theory is a much more modern version of this. It's a functional way of looking at dreams, and I actually like this information processing model of dreams. But this suggests that dreams are a way of processing information from the day. It's a way of hitting the save button in a way and recording information into long-term memory. It's also a mental realm where we can solve problems, think creatively, and even practice skills that we've acquired during the day. So in this case, dreaming is evolutionarily advantageous because we can practice skills. We can record our memories during this period where we're not essentially not doing anything else. So the brain can focus on these skills and tasks that are necessary for maintaining our skill and awareness. The activation synthesis model, again, has some evidence to it, but since these are theoretical models, we can't necessarily argue one over the other. I personally like the information processing theory. I don't like the activation synthesis model, which doesn't mean that it's not it doesn't mean that it's not a valid theory. The activation synthesis model says simply that dreams are your brain's way of interpreting random neural firing, right? Your neurons never turn off. So the neurons in your occipital lobe continue to fire and continue to be active while you're asleep. This and so your brain has to interpret these random signals that are occurring while you're asleep. So the activation synthesis model is just that. It's random neural energy that your brain has to struggle to interpret while you're asleep. So what happens if we don't get enough sleep? Since sleep is so important, what happens if we don't get enough? In general, if we could sleep as long as we wanted, most people would sleep for about 8 or 9 hours. Babies and young people need more. Very old people may need less. But in general, your body will find a rhythm that allows you to sleep for as long as you need, as long as you don't ever set an alarm clock or such. Chronic sleep loss, however, which can occur at any time for a variety of reasons, uh, can result in reduced immune system function, so you can actually get sick far more easily. It can reduce your ability to concentrate significantly. A higher rate of accidents is extremely common, actually to the point that every time we have a daylight savings shift, accidents both at home, on the road, and at work increase by 20% for a week. For that 1 hour change in how we sleep, accidents are far more likely. And it can also lower productivity and prevent people from getting their work done. Because if you're easily distracted, it's very difficult to complete your tasks efficiently. There are some myths about sleep deprivation. Sleep deprivation will not make you go crazy. Sleep deprivation will not make you peel your skin off, that sort of thing. And these myths actually do exist. You can look up these myths online. Both the CIA and the KGB did sleep deprivation studies. And while people who are deprived of sleep for long periods of time, whether through the use of drugs or not, they do become very agitated. They do become increasingly irrational as the sleep debt increases. After a certain period of time, it doesn't matter how much drugs you give them, it doesn't matter how often you disrupt their sleep, they will eventually fall asleep. And you can continue to wake them back up, but after a certain point, the body and the brain can no longer maintain it and will fall asleep and will maintain sleep, even falling into, for instance, stage 4 and sort of staying there for a period of time. After any period of sleep deprivation, though, and particularly deprivation of REM sleep, we encounter what we refer to as REM rebound. Your brain absolutely needs REM sleep, and this is our biggest argument for your brain needs REM sleep, is the fact that we have this REM rebound. After a period of REM deprivation, you get intense REM cycles that can they actually last longer than most REM cycles, and the brainwaves are larger and faster than most other REM cycles. Most people undergoing REM rebound will report unpleasant dreams or even nightmares during this period. The nightmares can be extremely vivid as well. Lots of different drugs can cause REM rebound during withdrawal. Alcohol, amphetamines, and cocaine all suppress REM sleep or simply suppress sleep at all. And LSD causes some very odd sleep effects while the individual is coming down off of it. But they all result in suppressed REM sleep and thus REM rebound during withdrawal. Okay. By far, the most common form of sleep disorder is insomnia. Uh, Insomnia affects almost everyone at some point in their lives. Most people, when they encounter insomnia, have what we refer to as acute insomnia, which occurs only for maybe 1, 2, 3, or 4 nights in a row. Occasionally, individuals have chronic insomnia, which can last for 2 weeks or even for years, where the individual has either difficulty going to sleep or has difficulty with waking earlier than they want to. And insomnia is simply not getting enough sleep because you have difficulty going to sleep or you're waking up before you want to. Okay. Chronic or acute insomnia can be caused by stress, it can be caused by drug use, it can be caused by illness even. Whereas chronic insomnia is more likely to be either an organic or genetic issue. In some cases, drug use may also cause chronic insomnia even after the drug use is stopped. Okay? And insomnia is extremely common. Like I said, almost anyone can encounter it, and chronic insomnia is fairly common, so we actually treat insomnia quite a bit. The second most common sleep disorder is sleep apnea, and we think this actually occurs more often than we think it does. But with sleep apnea, the individual stops breathing at least once, usually more than once, during the night. The worst cases of sleep apnea, an individual can stop breathing almost 300 times per night. Sleep apnea is far more common in overweight men and far more common among smokers than it is among the general population. Sleep apnea can, in some cases, even be fatal. While most sleep apnea simply wakes the person up just enough that they start breathing again, it disrupts the sleep cycle and causes the person to have more difficulty sleeping. In some cases, though, sleep apnea can involve even, for instance, swallowing the tongue, which can be fatal and cause the person to stop breathing altogether. Um, that is very rare and almost exclusively in overweight male smokers that is even a risk. Sleep apnea, like snoring, can be treated by positive pressure machines, CPAP machines. Um, one of the problems with these positive pressure machines is that they are loud and can actually cause or exacerbate insomnia among people who have, for instance, both problems. Other sleep disorders, one of the most famous sleep disorders is narcolepsy. This narcolepsy is extreme daytime sleepiness, but the famous aspect of it is these sleep attacks, where the individual will very suddenly fall asleep, almost at random during the day. And this can happen from a couple of times a day to a couple of times a week. That narcolepsy causes a human to fall asleep. Most narcolepsy is caused by genetic factors, and we can use amphetamines to reduce the symptoms. That is simply to keep someone awake. And amphetamine is a stimulant, and thus helps the person stay awake. But there's no cure for narcolepsy. Narcolepsy is actually more common in animals. Purebred dogs, because there's so much inbreeding during the process of purebreeding dogs, we actually have a problem with narcolepsy among purebred dogs. And in this case, narcolepsy can actually be fatal to the animal. Things like the animal gets excited when you put down food, and the narcolepsy kicks in and they fall asleep. So when they wake back up, then they see the food and they get excited and they fall asleep again, and they're unable to eat, which can be a fatal problem for these animals. With other animals, such as the fainting goats, narcolepsy is actually an evolutionary advantage. These individuals, or about a third of the individuals in the herd of fainting goats, are narcoleptic and will fall asleep if badly startled. This is actually an advantage for the goats because if a predator jumps out at the herd, some of the goats fall over. They fall asleep and fall over, and they become very stiff when it happens. This confuses the predator because now there are obviously sick animals that the predator could easily prey upon, and so the rest of the herd quickly gets away while the predator checks to make sure that these animals aren't already dead, to make sure that they're not rotting, because most predators will not eat rotting meat. And so they have to check to make sure that the fainted goats haven't been dead for a while. This can save the rest of the herd, and then the fainting goats will either wake up, which confuses the predator even more, allowing them to leave, or they smell so bad that the predator thinks they're already dead, something like that. But even if the predator does claim a few of the narcoleptic goats, most of them escape very effectively, and it preserves the healthy goats. So this is actually an evolutionary advantage for them. It's not an evolutionary advantage for humans. Sleepwalking, or somnambulism is the word for it, sleepwalking, also occurs in children. It very rarely occurs in adults, although there have been recent reports of somnambulism in adults. With children, it's most common during times of stress or excitement. When the child is having trouble going to sleep anyway, they may experience sleepwalking. This almost always occurs during stage 3 or 4 sleep. Sleepwalking does not occur during REM dreams. During REM dreams, remember, the individual is paralyzed and cannot move. So there's no way for the individual to begin sleepwalking during stage 3 or 4 sleep. While there's no known cause of sleepwalking, it is not in and of itself dangerous, and most sleepwalkers can be very peacefully led back to their bed while they're still asleep. It's a myth that waking a sleepwalker is dangerous to the sleepwalker. It's not, at least not directly. However, someone who is woken while they're sleepwalking may become disoriented, lose their balance. They may fall or even lash out, causing a certain amount of danger at the moment that they wake up. However, the act of waking them up is not in and of itself dangerous. It's usually easier, however, just to lead the person back to their bed. There have been cases recently of adults who have been sleepwalking. Certain sleep drugs like Lunesta, like Ambien, have caused sleepwalking behaviors. People who have, not like Roseanne, but people who have legitimately texted or even gone online while they're asleep, who have gotten up and made food and eaten a lot in some cases while they were asleep. People who have gotten in their cars and gone for drives while they were asleep, or even found exes, or gotten into bed and even started having sex while they were asleep. And so these drugs these drug manufacturers actually had a fairly large lawsuit as a result of these sleepwalking episodes. While most children who are sleepwalking aren't old enough to get into a lot of trouble while they're sleepwalking, adults have unconscious and procedural skills that can allow for things to get out of hand if they're not aware of what they're doing. Night terrors is very similar to somnambulism. Again, it occurs during stage 3 or 4 sleep and almost exclusively with children. Night terrors should not be confused with nightmares. Nightmares are scary REM dreams. Night terrors occur during stage 3 or 4 sleep. The child will often sit up in bed, their eyes will be open, screaming and crying. It's scary for the adult, it's scary for the parent, because it sounds like the child is in pain. It sounds like they're being terrorized. It sounds like they're frightened for their lives. And so the adult, of course, rushes in and tries to comfort this unresponsive, screaming, crying child. The child is still asleep during this period. Even if their eyes are open, they're asleep. You can wake a child up from a night terror, but it disrupts their sleep schedule. So unless they're having a lot of night terrors, unless it's a serious problem, you should generally just let them play it out. It won't last for more than a couple of minutes. And they'll go back to sleep, and in the morning they won't remember anything. People who experience sleepwalking and night terrors do not remember the episodes when they're awake. Largely because it is during stage 3 or 4 sleep. They're having a lot of delta wave sleep. They're very, very deeply asleep and don't remember what's actually happening. So individuals who have night terrors do not remember the night terror, and it's not dangerous to them. Psychoactive drugs is any substance that alters our awareness, behavior, sensation, perception, or mood. Generally, when we talk about psychoactive drugs, we talk about recreational drugs, but that's not necessarily the case. Even, for instance, ibuprofen alters our sensation and perception of pain, and thus it is, in a way, a psychoactive drug. most of the medications we take are psychoactive to one degree or another. However, when we talk about psychoactive drugs, again, we're usually talking about recreational drugs. And so we talk about broad categories of psychoactive drugs. And there are more than three, but we're going to talk about these three as sort of the major forms of psychoactive drugs that are present on the market. Depressants suppress CNS or central nervous system and bodily processes. They slow everything down. Alcohol, opioids, and benzodiazepines are common depressants. They make you sleepy. They make they make it harder to stay awake. They make it harder to respond rapidly to the world around you. And we do use depressants recreationally, and many depressants are legal or even over-the-counter medications. We can use stimulants. Okay, stimulants are exactly the reverse of depressants. They increase CNS activity and bodily processes. Caffeine is by far the most commonly used stimulant in the Western world, but there's also nicotine, for instance, in cigarettes and tobacco. Cocaine is a very common stimulant. Amphetamines and such things, these are all stimulants that we use to increase CNS activity. And then hallucinogens produce sensory or perceptual distortions referred to as hallucinations. You become aware of things that aren't there, hearing sounds, seeing things, that sort of thing. Marijuana, LSD, MDMA, these are the most common hallucinogens, and of course they all have different effects on your sensory and perceptual distortions. But hallucinogens are very broadly used as recreational medication. Interestingly, hallucinogens, again, in and of themselves, tend to be the safest of these three forms of drugs. Hallucinogens, it's almost impossible to overdose on a hallucinogen. Hallucinogens are not addictive. In fact, hallucinogens can actually reduce the addictive effects of other drugs. However, some of the effects of hallucinogens can be effective or can be dangerous. For instance, if you're driving while you're hallucinating, this can be very, very dangerous because it's difficult to tell where other cars are. There can be frightening hallucinations that cause you to do unpredictable or dangerous behaviors while you're on hallucinogenic medication. And of course, most hallucinogens are also illegal. Although personally I would classify NyQuil as a hallucinogen. Some of the effects that it has absolutely can cause hallucinogenic effects. So that's illegal. But technically, again, it's a depressant, not a hallucinogen. Although, and again, alcohol has hallucinogenic effects as well. So these categories tend to be kind of broad, but that doesn't mean that that any of them are necessarily safe. Psychoactive drugs work by affecting the neurotransmitters of the brain, usually dopamine pathways. This reward and learning pathway associated with dopamine is associated very closely with our sense of pleasure and reward responses. Okay. This pathway is stimulated either directly or indirectly by the use of the drugs. For instance, cocaine stimulates the dopamine pathway directly. It actually acts on dopamine receptors. Alcohol does not work on dopamine receptors, but still triggers this pleasure pathway because of its other effects. Some things that we could consider a psychoactive drug, like gambling, have no direct biological effect on the brain, but still trigger this reward pathway in an unhealthy and stimulating way. We believe that some individuals actually have what we refer to as a reward deficiency syndrome. And while we have no direct proof of this reward deficiency syndrome, we believe that it causes some people to find events to be less rewarding than most people find them to be. So when they make an achievement, when they succeed at something, they don't find that rewarding. They don't find pleasure in that moment, and it causes them to seek out a way of deriving pleasure in the world through drugs rather than through genuine rewards. Every culture in the world has found ways to induce altered states of consciousness. Trance rituals, spiritual possession, talking in tongues, um, all forms of religious rites are ways of inducing altered states of consciousness. Okay? Meditation, of course, hypnosis, drug use all over the world. Um, and every culture has developed drug use of one form or another, even if it's just alcohol, in order to induce an altered state of consciousness. And of course, that's what religious rites are for, right? Even if you go to church, your religious rites, it's intended to take you away from your normal state of consciousness, where you're worried about your work and school and all of that, and instead focus your consciousness onto something higher, to focus your consciousness onto prayer and onto God, right? So your religious rites, they're trying to invoke this altered state of consciousness. Um, Anytime you flood your awareness of the world with sensory information, okay? Repetitive chanting and drums, dancing induces an altered state of consciousness. Whirling in circles. In fact, the legend of the whirling dervish was actually, these were Arabic warriors who would spin in circles very rapidly for a long period of time until they entered an altered state of consciousness, and then would run screaming into battle just out of their minds on this artificial high, essentially, uh, that made them terrifying warriors. So this whirling in circles absolutely does produce an altered state of consciousness. Um, Burning strong or pungent incense, this is what tobacco was originally used for, was to enter an altered state of consciousness. You can also use sex, you can use pain, you can use even sensory deprivation skills. So things like sensory deprivation tanks are used to enter this altered state of consciousness. We found that people who are exposed to sound at less than 0 decibels, which 0 decibels is your sensory threshold for sound. So zero decibels is not no sound at all. About negative 20 decibels is no sound at all. We found that people who are exposed to sound levels less than 0 decibels begin to hallucinate and enter this altered state of consciousness as well. So every culture in the world has developed a way of entering altered states of consciousness. Um, so, consider how you enter altered states of consciousness, um, because almost certainly you do, in one form or another. So that's consciousness. If hopefully something about that interested you, and you can come up with some questions for class.